My name is Elaine Porter, and I will never forget the night applause turned into my public humiliation. The Chicago Hilton ballroom shimmered beneath golden chandeliers, champagne glasses clinking, laughter echoing across polished marble. A massive banner stretched across the far wall honoring innovation. My name had just been called. After 22 years of sacrifice, I was to be recognized for designing the company's largest logistics platform contracts worth $1.9 billion worldwide. At 57 years old, I stepped forward, my pulse rising with the rhythm of applause. It should have been my proudest moment. Instead, it became my undoing. At the head table, CEO Martin Kessler stood raising his glass. His words silenced the room. Let tonight be a reminder. Innovation may come from many hands, but control belongs to one. Effective immediately, Elaine's salary will be reduced by 70%. The air cracked. Applause died. Forks hovered above plates. Even the quartet faltered before stumbling back into tune. In a single sentence, Martin turned recognition into spectacle. I remained motionless, calm on the surface, though fury burned beneath. This was no private reprimand. It was a public execution of dignity. For 22 years, I had carried this company, stabilizing crises, drafting contracts, missing birthdays, and sitting in hospital corridors with my daughter's bills while still logged into servers past midnight. I asked for no applause, only stability. And now, a man who inherited his crown without sacrifice stripped me bare before those who had profited from my work. But I saw something he didn't. Investors at the front table leaned together, whispering unease etched on their faces. His arrogance hadn't destroyed me. It had cracked his own empire. That silence clung to me long after. One thought pressed against my ribs, 22 years reduced to a sentence. When I joined, I was a 35-year-old engineer with only a second-hand laptop and stubborn determination. I worked nights, missed milestones, endured relentless pressure. Yet under that weight, I built. And nothing, not even Martin's arrogance, could erase that truth. The dashboards glowed green while executives who barely understood the systems clapped each other on the back. I remembered the night I signed my first major contract, clause 1, that saved us from penalties that could have bankrupted a smaller firm. I was invisible in those moments, but I knew the truth. Without me, none of it stood. That pride was laced with bitterness now. Every sacrifice had once felt justified. I told myself it was worth it. Stability for the company meant stability for me. And yet, in the span of a breath, Martin Kessler dismissed it all with a raised glass and a smirk. He had no idea what it meant to give yourself completely. His crown was inherited, his path smooth paved by his father's wealth. Mine was carved from exhaustion and persistence, sharpened by rejection and resilience. I was proud of that. Even in bitterness, there was quiet pride because what I built was real. It could not be undone by his arrogance. Still, humiliation has a way of pulling old memories to the surface. One burned hardest. It was 3:00 a.m. 2 years ago when an alert ripped through my phone. The network was seconds from collapse, a cascading failure that would erase contracts and shatter investor confidence. I dragged myself from bed half asleep into the office. Alone in the glow of monitors, I wrote patch after patch, sweat stinging my eyes, hands shaking from exhaustion. At 4:12 a.m., the system stabilized. Millions were saved. Disaster averted. The next morning, Martin strolled into the boardroom in his tailored suit. He smiled as though nothing had happened. "Gentlemen, you can thank decisive leadership for last night's stability." He never glanced at me. The board applauded. My name was never spoken. That memory burned like acid. Martin could steal credit, cut my salary, even humiliate me, but he could never build what I had built. And that, I realized, was his weakness. To Martin, Kessler, risk was nothing more than a game. He tossed around numbers that represented livelihoods, as if they were poker chips at his private table. He could afford to gamble. Losing millions would never change the course of his life. Generations of wealth had woven a safety net beneath him, cushions upon cushions. I, on the other hand, knew what it was to scrape. I knew the weight of medical bills, the sting of being overlooked, the exhaustion of dragging myself home at 200 a.m., only to return by 7:00. My authority came not from fear but from competence, the quiet certainty that if I was in the room, the system would hold. Martin never understood that. To him, control wasn't about stability, it was about spectacle. He ruled by intimidation. His favorite weapon was humiliation. Meetings became performances, not decisions. He cut off junior managers mid-sentence, sneered at proposals, slammed his hand on the table to punctuate his superiority. Many bowed their heads, too afraid to challenge him. But to me, every outburst revealed fragility. A man who truly holds power doesn't need to shout. The longer I watched him, the more disgust settled in. I had given 22 years to building something enduring while he had given nothing but orders from behind polished doors. And yet, he was celebrated as the architect of success the face investors trusted. It was grotesque theater suffocating to stand beside. Then came the moment that burned itself into me. As the crowd broke into smaller conversations, I stepped back, near a marble column at the ballroom's edge. Martin's laughter carried across the space, careless and deep. A glass of whiskey in hand, he leaned toward another executive, his voice lowered but still loud enough to cut through the hum. "I can humiliate her in front of every single one of them," he chuckled. "And she'll still crawl back to work Monday morning." The words landed like sparks on dry kindling. It wasn't arrogance, it was contempt. He believed I was trapped, my devotion chaining me no matter how cruelly he cut me down. He was wrong. His words didn't break me. They lit the fuse of my resolve. Silence was not weakness. It was a shield, and sometimes a weapon. 2 years earlier, during one of the hardest stretches of my career, I sat across from overseas partners in a sterile conference room in Tokyo. The air buzzed with tension. Millions of dollars rested on those agreements. Martin Kessler was there for the photos and the dinners. But when the fine print appeared, he vanished. That responsibility fell to me, and I took it seriously, not just for the company, but for my own survival. I knew then what many refused to admit: loyalty was conditional. Executives could praise you one week and discard you the next. I had watched brilliant minds escorted out with cardboard boxes, their years reduced to a line in a quarterly report. I refused to let that be my fate. So as I drafted the security clauses for those high-value contracts, I buried a safeguard. Hidden among technical jargon was a single line: any unilateral change to the compensation of the chief architect, me, without my signed approval, would render the contracts void within 24 hours. It was one sentence among hundreds, but it was ironclad. I refined it until no loophole remained. To most it looked like a technical stipulation. To me, it was survival. If you've walked with me this far, don't let the journey end here. Hit subscribe and join me for the next chapter, where silence turns into strength and strength into legacy. I remembered a junior lawyer frowning at the draft, tapping his pen. "This clause here, are we sure it's necessary? It seems oddly specific." Before I could speak, a senior executive waved him off. "Elaine's just being cautious. Move on." The page turned. My safeguard remained buried. That dismissal became the seed of everything that followed. I didn't smile when the contracts were signed. I didn't celebrate. I simply filed away the knowledge if the day ever came when I was treated as disposable, their empire could collapse in less than 24 hours. Now standing in the golden glow of the Chicago ballroom, humiliation still burning on my skin, I felt that memory return like steel in my hand. Martin thought he had broken me. He didn't realize he had just triggered the very condition I had written years earlier. He had triggered it, and soon they would all learn how costly that oversight would be. The clinking of glasses had barely faded when Martin Kessler turned toward me with a flourish. In his hand gleamed a sleek fountain pen, gold-tipped, more for show than function. He extended it toward me with a smile built for cameras. "Come on, Elaine," he said, his voice dripping with mock warmth. "Let's make this official. Sign here. Show them how proud you are to be part of our future." A neat stack of documents lay on the podium. To the crowd, it looked ceremonial, a symbolic gesture to crown the evening. But I knew better. I knew what was buried in those pages, and I knew what my signature would mean. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from calculation. I let my hand hover above the paper, then slowly drew it back. Murmurs rippled across the ballroom. Some thought I was stunned, too humiliated to comply. They mistook hesitation for weakness. Only I knew the truth. Silence was louder than refusal, and silence forced Martin to reclaim the spotlight he feared losing. Predictably, he did with a smirk. Straightening his tie, he snatched back the pen and scrawled his own name across the top page with a flourish meant for cameras. Flashbulbs sparked. Applause stumbled back to life. He lifted his arm like a conqueror. But I remained still, expression unreadable, while quiet satisfaction unfurled inside me. His arrogance had just written its most costly line. He thought he humiliated me further by signing in my place, proving he controlled the stage. What he didn't realize was that his ink had sealed not my fate, but his. Among those ceremonial acknowledgments lay the supplemental clause, confirmation the tripwire I had buried years ago. His signature was the final key. To the room, it was theater. To me, it was vindication. As he basked in the glow of cameras, I could almost see the invisible countdown begin. 24 hours, that was all it would take for his empire to collapse under his own arrogance. The empire Martin thought he controlled was already collapsing, and he had been the one to light the fuse. The morning after the gala arrived with a strange stillness. I expected to wake restless, replaying his smirk or the sting of his words. Instead, I felt calm. It was the quiet before a storm, the hum beneath your skin, when something irreversible has already begun. I dressed with care, choosing the dark suit I reserved for long negotiations. The mirror reflected a face I barely recognized, composed, steady, almost detached. Anticipation coiled like a spring, but I pressed it down. Patience would be my sharpest weapon. By 8:30 a.m., I stepped into the glass-walled lobby of headquarters. The atmosphere had shifted overnight. The usual chatter and greetings were gone. People hurried in silence, eyes darting nervously between phones and screens. I walked through it without a word, my briefcase steady at my side. The first call came at my desk. A manager from Tokyo, voice tight with panic, reported a $620 million transfer frozen without warning. Our largest Asian partner had suspended payments, citing contractual irregularities. Then came the second call, Singapore, then Hong Kong. One after another, alerts cascaded like falling dominoes. Contracts that had seemed immovable days earlier unraveled in real time. The clause Martin had triggered was doing its work. Around me, whispers swelled. Employees clustered near elevators, wide-eyed. "Did you hear 600 million frozen?" Screens glowed with headlines. Emails piled up with red flags. The hum of uncertainty grew louder by the hour. I sat still, hands folded, eyes fixed on papers I wasn't reading. My pulse hammered, but I revealed nothing. Let them think I was stunned. Silence was my cover. Executives rushed by, muttering breach, compliance, emergency. The walls themselves seemed to press inward under the weight of chaos. At 9:40, the CFO's assistant stormed past, pale and frantic. "Contracts invalidated. Insurance won't cover. Martin has to address this now." Inside, satisfaction pulsed like a steady drum. My phone buzzed with a private message from an old investor. 4 words glowed on the screen. "Your safeguard worked. Now wait." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The confirmation wasn't necessary. I already knew the trap had been sprung. Still, seeing it in black and white steadied me. This wasn't rumor. It was fact. I leaned back in my chair, letting the chaos of the office wash over me. Phones, ringing heels, clicking voices rising in panic. I offered no comfort, no explanation. The longer I held my silence, the more Martin would scramble and the more the truth would tighten around him like a noose. Waiting wasn't weakness. Waiting was control. By 10:15 a.m., the panic had grown louder. What began as a frozen transfer in Asia spread like wildfire. My inbox filled with alerts. Urgent European partner suspends contract. Then another immediate action required. By noon, another $400 million was gone. Even seasoned executives went pale. The markets punished us instantly. Stock tickers bled red. Years of expansion unraveled in hours. I walked the halls in silence, my expression carefully blank. But inside satisfaction hummed steady. I didn't need to announce anything. The system I built was speaking for me, stripping away Martin's illusions with every headline. By 11:00 a.m., the executive conference room was overflowing. Assistants rushed in with papers, IT managers set up emergency video feeds, and board members dialed in from around the globe. The air vibrated with panic. I slid quietly into a chair at the far end of the table, unacknowledged but watchful. Martin paced at the head tie, loosened hair damp with sweat. He barked orders into two phones, demanding answers no one could give. "We can't afford another suspension," he shouted, slamming a handset down. "Get legal on this. Find a loophole, anything, but I knew better." The clauses had been written by me, and they weren't cracks to patch. They were trapdoors already opened beneath him. Around me, whispers grew urgent. "Partners are panicking. Stock down 14%. We've never seen a hit like this." I kept my gaze lowered, letting the papers blur. The truth wasn't in documents. It was in their faces, fear replacing arrogance, doubt shifting toward Martin. And silence once again was my sharpest move. In the middle of a heated exchange with the CFO, Martin Kessler's composure cracked. The man who had built his identity on dominance lost control in front of everyone. His fist slammed against the polished wood so hard glasses rattled, one shattering to the floor. "Damn it," he roared, voice raw. "This company doesn't fall apart over paperwork." The room froze. No one spoke. For the first time, they saw what I had always known. Beneath his cultivated authority was only panic waiting to break through. His power had always been theater, and the performance was unraveling. I leaned back, slightly calm on the surface, steady in my breathing. Inside, vindication burned hot and clean. This was the moment I had long imagined, Martin revealing himself not as a leader, but as a man unprepared for real consequences. By 12:30 p.m., the conference room had turned into a pressure chamber. The air thickened with sweat and static. Executives barked at one another, phones slammed down, and every few minutes another report flashed on the screen, our market value bleeding away in red numbers. At the head of the table, the CFO shuffled through contracts, his face growing paler with each page. Normally calm, even in turbulence, he looked like a surgeon who had just discovered the wound was beyond repair. Finally, he pushed his chair back with a screech that silenced the room. "These contracts," he said, voice thin, "they're not suspended. They're void." The words landed like a bomb. "What do you mean, void?" Martin barked, sweat rolling down his temple. "Our partners are within their rights," the CFO whispered. "The agreements are airtight. There's no appeal. They're gone." Shouts erupted. "Call the insurers," someone yelled. The CFO shook his head. "Insurance won't cover this. It isn't an accident. It's a clause. Ironclad, deliberate." Panic stormed the room. Phones lit up. Voices collided. Executives cursed under their breath. Others stared blankly as billions unraveled. Through it all, I sat quietly, hands folded, breathing measured. Let them think I was stunned. Silence remained my strongest disguise. For the first time, the man who ruled by fear looked afraid. Then it came, the spark that shifted everything. A junior lawyer, barely in his 30s, flipped through contracts at lightning speed. His brow furrowed deeper until suddenly he shot to his feet, waving a page. Who wrote this clause? He demanded, voice cracking above the chaos. Who put this language in the contracts? The noise died instantly. Phones lowered, shouts choked off, chairs creaked. The room fell into silence so sharp it rang in my ears. One by one, their eyes turned past the CFO, past the executives, past Martin himself until they landed on me at the far end of the table. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I sat calm, silent, even as 24 stares pinned me in place. Inside, satisfaction pulsed steady. The trap I had laid years ago was no longer invisible. It was undeniable, irreversible. Martin had demanded loyalty through humiliation, and now his arrogance had exposed the one person he could never break. By 2:07 p.m., the tension reached a fever pitch. Executives barked into phones, lawyers shuffled papers, assistants rushed in and out like medics in an emergency ward. The company felt like a patient hemorrhaging faster than anyone could stop the bleeding. Martin raised his hand, demanding silence. His tie was crooked, his face flushed, but his voice carried the old command. I've engaged the best. We've retained Caro and Hunt, the top legal firm in the country. If anyone can untangle this, it's them. For a moment, the room shifted. Shoulders straightened. A few sighs of relief. Caro and Hunt had a reputation for salvaging disasters, finding loopholes where none existed. Board members exchanged glances, panic softening. Martin seized on it instantly. You see, this is not the end. It's a stumble. By tomorrow, contracts will be restored. The market will rebound. This hysteria will look like an overreaction. He even smiled, the same smug curve that had cut me down the night before. I knew better, but I said nothing. Illusions are most dangerous when they are closest to breaking. The illusion of calm lingered for only a few hours. Phones quieted, voices dropped, and the board convinced themselves that Caro and Hunt would find a loophole. Martin Kessler even carried himself taller, speaking not of crisis but of recovery. Yet illusions always have a half-life. At 6:40 p.m. the call came. The lead partner's voice filled the room, smooth but edged with finality. We've completed our review. The contracts cannot be reinstated. The nullification clause is absolute. This isn't suspension, it's termination. The air thinned. There must be precedent. Martin snapped, his voice cracking. Some challenge. The lawyer cut him off. Mr. Kessler, the clause was activated by your own signature. It is airtight. There is no appeal. It's over. The silence that followed was heavier than panic. Then the turn came. A director leaned forward, his tone steady and lethal. You signed it. Another voice. You triggered it. And then another. You've cost us billions. The murmurs sharpened into accusations. For years the board applauded him, but now they circled like wolves, and Martin, once predator, was suddenly prey. I sat at the far end, hands folded, expression neutral, letting the tide consume him. It was no longer panic. It was tribunal. By 7:30 p.m., the room reeked of sweat and paper. Contracts covered in red ink littered the table. Emails glowed across the screen, each line a blade. The CFO's voice carried the weight of a funeral. Because the clause was activated by your personal signature. Martin, liability does not fall solely on the corporation. It extends to you individually. Martin blinked, uncomprehending. What do you mean individually? The CFO pressed his lips tight. Your personal assets are exposed. Homes, trusts, offshore accounts, everything. For a man who had lived untouchable, the words hit harder than any market crash. His face drained of color. A director leaned forward, voice like broken glass. You didn't just endanger the company, you've endangered yourself. And in that moment, I knew the empire wasn't merely collapsing. It was consuming its creator. and by extension, all of us. Another director's voice cut sharper. Investors won't shoulder this loss alone. They'll come for blood yours. The words landed like a blade. For the first time, Martin's face betrayed fear. His jaw slackened, his hands trembled. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man staring at the shadow of a guillotine. From the far end of the table, I sat composed, my silence unbroken. I didn't need to speak. Every revelation, every legal stipulation was cutting him open more efficiently than anything I could say. The lawyers pressed in their words. Clinical. Your trusts aren't shielded. The clauses specify forfeiture of any assets tied to your personal estate. Damages will be sought from you directly. Martin's lips parted, but no sound came. He had built his empire on the illusion of safety that wealth and lawyers would always absorb the blow. Now the consequences he'd once pushed onto others stood at his own doorstep. Then came the final strike. A senior attorney, her voice steel, set her files flat. There is only one person who can reverse this. Only one who can save you. Elaine Porter. Every head turned toward me. 24 pairs of eyes waited for the smallest crack in my expression. I gave them nothing. My face remained still, my gaze steady silence wrapping me like armor. Inside, satisfaction coiled tight. The man who had humiliated me in front of hundreds now stood stripped bare, his empire collapsing, his fortune bleeding, his pride gutted. And the cruelest truth, his only lifeline belonged to me. When his eyes finally met mine, desperation replaced arrogance. For the first time, Martin didn't look at me as expendable. He looked at me as his last hope. 1 week later, the numbers finished the story. $1.9 billion in contracts gone. Shares that once gleamed on Wall Street now plummeted in red cascades. Inside headquarters, whispers replaced bravado. Desks, emptied hallways echoed, and the cafeteria resembled a morgue. And at the center of it all stood Martin Kessler, a man finally undone by his own hand. Martin Kessler once strutted through these corridors like a monarch. Now he looked gaunt, his eyes hollow, his movements jerky with exhaustion. Board members avoided him. Executives spoke his name only in whispers. His power hadn't just weakened, it had vanished. By Monday morning, he stood before the board resignation letter trembling in his hand. The man who once barked commands could barely finish 2 sentences without his voice cracking. Effective immediately, he stammered, I will be stepping down as Chief Executive Officer. No applause followed, no polite nods. The room was ice. He had gone from tyrant to ghost in less than a week. The blows didn't stop there. Lawsuits poured in, shareholders demanding damages, regulators circling partners, severing ties. His wealth, once shielded, was under siege. Mansions, trust funds, and offshore accounts were dragged into the spotlight. His humiliation became public spectacle. Headlines blared, CEO topples. After $1.9 billion collapse, news anchors dissected his downfall. Late-night hosts turned him into a punchline, replaying his furious fist slam until it became a meme. Through it all, I remained silent. I walked the halls calmly, neither gloating nor explaining. Inside, though, relief burned steady. 22 years of sacrifice had been mocked, my dignity shredded. Now balance had been restored. The final blow didn't come from me. It came from those who once cheered him. At a crowded board meeting, an investor's voice cut through the noise. We will only renegotiate if Elaine Porter is at the table. The words dropped like a hammer. Heads turned, but this time there was no contempt in their eyes, only recognition. They understood what Martin never had. I was the foundation. Without me, there was no future. For the first time in weeks, I breathed freely. This wasn't revenge born of cruelty. It was quiet truth. The empire collapsed because of him, not me. And now, with Martin gone, the dust settled, and the board turned toward me with urgency. Their words were unanimous. We need you as our next CEO. It represented everything I had once been denied: power, recognition, authority. And now the board was offering it to me, their voices urgent, their faces heavy with expectation. CEO. The title that had hovered like an unreachable prize for years, but I shook my head. No, I said softly, steady as stone. I didn't endure all of this just to become what I despised. The room blinked. Some argued, some pleaded, but I held firm. I would not inherit Martin Kessler's chair or his arrogance. My path was different. I'll remain, I continued, but as senior advisor. I'll guide the systems I built. I'll protect the foundation, but I will not wear the crown. After a long pause, they accepted it reluctantly, perhaps, but truth has a way of settling into silence. Leadership wasn't about titles, it was about responsibility. And responsibility, I had learned, could be carried without spectacle. In my new office, stripped of pomp, I hung only one thing: a framed copy of the contract Martin Kessler had signed that night. His signature, once a mark of dominance, now stood as a monument to downfall. I didn't display it as a trophy, but as a reminder: arrogance carries within it the seed of its own destruction. Each day, I worked quietly with teams who once overlooked me. They approached not with fear, but with respect. They knew I wouldn't demand silence with a roar or humiliate them into obedience. I had endured, and in enduring, I had proven something Martin Kessler never could. Freedom isn't the absence of struggle. It's the choice to walk through fire and emerge with dignity intact. So I lived not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. Not as a CEO, but as a woman once humiliated in a glittering ballroom who chose not vengeance but vindication. Sometimes I still stood before that framed signature and reflected. Not with bitterness, not even triumph, but with clarity. Power doesn't vanish in one explosion. It erodes, chipped away by arrogance, until a single careless stroke brings it all crashing down. That truth was my legacy. I've told you my story, but now I want to hear yours. Have you ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or stripped of dignity, only to find your strength in silence? Share your experiences in the comments. Support me not just by listening, but by adding your voice to this conversation. And remember, life isn't about chasing titles or power. It's about protecting your integrity, even when no one is watching. If my journey resonates with you like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so we can walk through more stories of resilience together.